Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm just going to give a few minutes for attendees to enter the Zoom room. So just a few minutes, please. Welcome, everyone. Just waiting for participants to enter the Zoom room. So just another minute, please. And I'm just going to give it just another few seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Cushman. I'm director of the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University. I'm delighted to welcome people from around the world to HEFNU's annual Theodore Zev Weiss Lecture in Holocaust Studies. A warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here. First, an acknowledgement of place. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of Three Tribes, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. It is in close proximity to a large urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. Illinois remains home to over 100,000 tribal members. Second, a few words about the Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University. HEFNU supports university-level Holocaust education across the country and around the world. We host the biennial Lessons and Legacies Conference, which we've postponed for a second time to November 2022, a European conference every 4 years, an annual Summer Institute on the Holocaust and Jewish Civilization, several annual regional institutes on the Holocaust, and competitive teaching and research grants. We welcome your financial support of our work. For more information or to make a donation, please visit our website at hef.northwestern.edu. If you would like to join our mailing list, please let us know by emailing us at hef@northwestern.edu. And finally, to our lecture today. HEFNU is delighted to host Eva Hoffman for our annual Theodore Zev Weiss Lecture in Holocaust Studies. The Theodore Zev Weiss Lecture is named for the founder of the Holocaust Educational Foundation, who passed away last fall. Zev Weiss was born in Hungary, and in June 1944, German forces deported him and his family to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where his parents, younger sister, and brother were murdered. Zev was 12 years old, and he survived Auschwitz as part of a work crew. He also survived several other camps and a death march. He was liberated by American forces on the 8th of May, 1945. He set out for Palestine with other young Jewish survivors, but was turned back by the British. In 1947, he went to Canada, where he studied at McGill University and the Hebrew Teacher Seminary. In 1956, he moved to the United States, where he met and married Alice, who was then an assistant professor at SUNY Albany. Eventually, Zev and Alice landed in Wilmette, Illinois, where Zev served as education director at the Beth Hillel Academy for 22 years. All the while, Zev envisioned educating the public about the Holocaust. He and Alice and a group of friends met in 1976 and created the Holocaust Educational Foundation. Their first project was to film survivor testimonies, but Zev realized more was needed. One of his greatest, but certainly not his only insights, was that the college level was the best place for students to encounter Holocaust education, and that university level Holocaust education needed a champion. He became that champion. The first such course, The History of the Holocaust, was launched at Northwestern University in 1988. Zev's determination, persistence, tirelessness, and gift of persuasion brought Holocaust studies to hundreds of universities across the United States. With the founding of HEF, Zev created an organization to support the growth of the field of Holocaust studies. Zev's goal was not only increasing the number of courses, he also aimed to prepare educators to teach knowledgeably and effectively. He offered funding and a summer institute. He also sought to support scholarship, inaugurating the biennial Lessons and Legacies Conference in the late 1980s, which continues to bring together a transgenerational and international community of scholars. In short, Zev built a foundation with a legacy with which I am endlessly proud to be associated. Every year, we take the opportunity to honor Zev's legacy by inviting a renowned speaker in the field to address the HEFNU community. Today, I'm delighted that Eva Hoffman will speak on the topic of coming after, the wand of transmission. Hoffman will be in conversation with Phyllis Lassner, Northwestern University Professor Emerita, reflecting on the role and perspective of the post-Holocaust generation. Deborah Cohen will introduce Lassner and Hoffman. It is my pleasure, however, to introduce very briefly Professor Deborah Cohen. Cohen is Richard W. Leopold Professor of History at Northwestern University and current chair of the department. Her specialty is modern European history with a focus on Britain. She is author of 3 books, The War Come Home from 2001, Household Gods, the British and Their Possessions, 2006, and Family Secrets from 2013. Her research has been funded by the Mellon Foundation, the National Humanities Center, the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Professor Cohen, welcome, and please take it from here. You're muted, one moment.
Yep, I got it. Okay, can everyone hear me? Excellent. Reading the writer Eva Hoffman is something like watching a dazzling aerialist. She executes feats of evocation and insight with absolute sure-footedness. She does the writerly equivalent of backflips on a wire with her precise, unsentimental, and always learned prose. Dr. Hoffman has tackled an enormous variety of subjects, from the problem of attention in her 2017 How to Be Bored, a subject we're all too familiar with, to post-1989 Eastern Europe in her astute, indeed often prophetic, Exit into History, which was published in 1993. Starting with her first book, the memoir Lost in Translation, and I know that we have many fans of this book in the audience today, she's delved into a huge number of subjects: emigration, exile, family, psychoanalysis, language, and of course, the aftermath of the Holocaust. Her work includes an account of Polish-Jewish coexistence, her book Shtetl, as well as 2 novels, radio programs, theater, and many, many essays and reviews. And of course, Hoffman is one of the very best known voices of the so-called second generation, a term that she characteristically calls into question, even as her insights have shaped how we think both about the children of Holocaust survivors and the issue of memory and loss more generally. On this subject, Hoffman's landmark book, After Such Knowledge, Memory, History, and the Legacy of the Holocaust, explores, in her words, quote, the very personal transactions with the past. She charts the afterlife of the Holocaust as seen both firsthand. Her Polish-Jewish parents survived in hiding, and also surveyed dispassionately in societal and psychological terms. Her interest is in the process by which memory becomes history, the need, as she puts it, to remember strenuously. After Such Knowledge is a book replete with striking images. For instance, the inverse homeopathic magic of a child attempting to remove the pain from her parents, minute dose by minute dose. Hoffman's imagery is precise and telling. Her sensibility is relentlessly subtle, probing, ironic, sweeping away the reductive clutter that tends to accumulate around very freighted subjects, like, for instance, the Polish-Jewish past. And when I compare her to an aerialist, it's because in reading her, one knows that she's not going to fall off the higher wire ever, but nonetheless, she's going to take your breath away with the daring of her analysis. Dr. Hoffman is currently a visiting professor at the University College London. She earned her PhD in literature at Harvard, has taught at Hunter College and MIT, among other universities, and has been awarded a number of fellowships and prizes, including the Guggenheim, the Whiting Foundation Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Prix Italia. Hoffman's interlocutor this afternoon is Professor Phyllis Lassner. She is Professor Emerita in the Crown Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, as well as the Gender and Writing programs at Northwestern. Professor Lassner has published widely in 6 books and many articles about women writers of the Second World War and about representations of the Holocaust in literature and film. A forthcoming article examines Eva Hoffman's play, The Ceremony. Professor Lassner serves on the Education and Outreach and the Exhibition Committees at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. So Professor Lassner and Dr. Hoffman will talk for approximately half an hour, and then we're going to open up the conversation for questions. Please put those questions in the Q&A, not in the chat function. And because the format is a Zoom webinar, then I'll go ahead and repeat them for the audience. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And I want to say how appreciative I am to Sarah Cushman for inviting me to participate in a conversation about Eva Hoffman, a daunting task. My own work has been so influenced by Eva's thinking, which is relentlessly wise and sensitive, humane, and even with, as Deborah said, with a kind of ironic distance. It's such a pleasure to be talking with her today. As Deborah mentioned, Eva's memoir, Lost in Translation, and what I'll refer to as her reflective histories after such knowledge, shtetl, and exit into history, have been acclaimed and influential internationally for her powerful and wise narratives about the lasting effects of the Holocaust on the second generation and beyond. I'd like to begin by asking Eva to introduce her story and telling us when and how she began to identify as second generation, even as Deborah said, she calls it into question, and what she thinks is the perspective of this generation and its contribution to knowledge of the Holocaust.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes. Well, first of all, let me say what a great pleasure and an honor it is really to have been asked to give this lecture, which is named in honor of a person whose history I didn't know, but who had such an amazing history. And what a pleasure it is to be in conversation with Phyllis and also with Deborah. I am not sure I can live up to a high wire act, but it really is a great pleasure as well as an honor for me to have been invited to do this. So Phyllis, to answer your question, I think I have to start with something indirect with my parents' history, at least a brief summation of it, because that is really where the story of the second generation begins. So my parents grew up in a tiny shtetl in what was then the Polish part of the Ukraine. Shtetls were, small towns which dotted the Polish landscape, and in which a part of the population, sometimes a large part, was Jewish. So the shtetl in which my parents grew up was almost evenly divided between Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian populations. during the Holocaust, they were hidden by Ukrainian and Polish neighbors, but all of their relatives died in a massacre perpetrated by the Nazis in what was a very violent vicinity, one of the worst vicinities for Jewish people to find themselves in during that time. But they were hidden by their neighbors. And it is no exaggeration to say that this compressed palette of facts was a kind of first knowledge for me, from which many other kinds of knowledge and understanding eventually unfolded. In a sense, the story, the sequelae of my parents' experiences were there for me from childhood. They were there in my mother's mourning for her sister who died, who was killed in that massacre. And in my childhood fantasies that I would nevertheless find her, that somehow she emerged alive and that I would find her and bring her back to my mother, and that my mother's mourning would be assuaged. It was there in my father's tales of danger and daring do. He really survived through acts of incredible wiliness and courage. And so it was there from the beginning, but I didn't yet think of myself as a member of the second generation, nor did my parents think of themselves as Holocaust survivors yet. The very term Holocaust didn't come into usage until later. They knew they had experienced terrible things, but the Holocaust was not yet separated from the other experience of the war. And, it should be, I suppose, said that Poland was the epicenter, really not of one, but two wars. The war of occupation, waged both by the Nazis and by the Soviets against the Poles, in which 3 million Poles died. And the project of extermination of the Jews, which was not executed by Poles, but it was executed largely on Polish soil. So it was not until later, until I was writing Lost in Translation, really, that I started excavating the post-Holocaust, the second generation thread of my history. Lost in Translation was, the subject of Lost in Translation was immigration and the process of transculturation and translating myself into another language and culture, which was my lived experience, and in some respects, a deeply sort of enlarging one, but also partly a traumatic experience. But it was when I was writing Lost in Translation that I started being aware of and excavating the post-Holocaust thread of my history. And I realized how deeply internalized these memories were and how threaded they were through my development, and how much they in fact affected my development and my relationship to my parents. At the same time, the term second generation started coming into usage. And as Deborah said, I was initially quite skeptical about it. I thought, that perhaps it reified very specific experiences into some general category. But nevertheless, there were books, for example, like the book New Lives, which was very keynote in all of this, by Helen Epstein, which consisted of interviews precisely with second generation people, those people who were children of Holocaust survivors. And by the way, like me, they were amazed to think that their experience counted as something significant and separate, and that it was, worth sort of excavating. Also, I started meeting people, often immigrants from Poland, of my own age, who had similar histories and who apparently experienced the same kinds of, internal trajectories. And so it became apparent that we did have a kind of shared history. It was a psychological history. I started thinking of ourselves, of this group as an imagined community. There is a notion of the nation as being imagined community. We were not a nation. We were not from the same nations or countries, but we were an imagined community of a kind. So this was my trajectory towards thinking of myself as a second generation person. Now, as for what we can bring to our understanding of the Holocaust, I do think, that we have a particular task in relation to it, in a particular relationship to it. We have lived very close to the experience of the Holocaust, to the human meanings, to the suffering of the catastrophe. Many of us have found it very difficult to separate from our parents and claim our own lives. But I think the separation is important, and it is important to move from our particular memories to a wider understanding of history. In any case, I think it is too easy to think that we have memories of the Holocaust. Memory of the Holocaust, like the second generation, became a kind of, formulaic phrase and a kind of honorific phrase, a phrase indicating a kind of honorific position. And I think this really does need to be decoded. We actually don't have memories of the Holocaust. Memories cannot be transferred from one person to another. What we do have an understanding of are the sequelae of that experience. And so I think, one of our first tasks is to move from the notion of memory to history. And I understood that even to comprehend my parents' specific experiences, I needed to locate them in a larger history. I needed to understand, the interethnic relations between the various groups inhabiting their shtetl. I needed to understand the movements of armies. I needed to understand, the invasion from the east by the Soviets and from the west by the Nazis, and the part that played in affecting the sort of the local interethnic relations. In my childhood, I thought, that I knew the attic in which they were hidden, but of course I didn't. What I understood was the fear and the huddled hiding and their grief as they heard about their relatives' deaths. So I do think we need to move into this notion of history, but I think from our position, we can understand that history and analyze it and perhaps write about it, or possibly, pass it on through educational institutions with all of its human meanings intact, as more abstract histories, often do not do. So I think that this is, one of the tasks that we have. Or in one of the sort of, what is given to us with our temporal position, really. I think the other sort of role that we have, and it really does come from our temporal position of coming after, is that we have seen other genocides, unfold in the last decades. The motto, never again, has not been fulfilled, of course. And we have seen other terrible instances of genocides and inter-ethnic violence. And I think we need to try to understand them from our position after. Also, we have a cross-cultural perspective, which for me has been very fruitful and very enriching and interesting, really. I have met with second generations, with descendants of traumatic histories in Japan and in China and in South Africa and in Rwanda. And the people I talked to often said that the body of research and writing and, memoir writing, among other things, about the Holocaust has been very helpful to them in grappling with their own histories. And to me, in turn, this has been a very reparative knowledge. It has, given me the sense that our own sort of, grappling with this history has not been in vain, that the kind of task has been fulfilled.
Thank you. Typically, Eva, your language is so precise and yet almost poetic, even as it evokes a history that, because of so many issues, needs to be represented very accurately. And I'd like to build on that to ask you about something that you wrote in your book, After Such Knowledge, in which, again, you're referring to the language of transmission, and you suggest that the challenges of translating ineffable images of trauma into a language of shared intergenerational meanings suggests a kind of haunting, a word that's so impressionistic and, you might think, contrary to the way we want an accurate history to be narrated. But let me quote from the passage that I refer to. In our small apartment, memories, no, not memories, but emanations of wartime experiences kept erupting in flashes of imaginary, in abrupt, fragmented phrases, in repetitious, broken refrains. They kept manifesting themselves with a frightening immediacy in that most private and potent of family languages, the language of the body. And I was wondering if you would reflect on that for us and talk a little bit more about what you meant by the phrases emanations and the languages of the body as mechanisms, if you like, of transmitting the history from one generation to another.
There have been many descendants of survivors who have talked about the difficulty of putting together a narrative of their parents' experiences, because the initial, form of speech in which, these experiences were transmitted were so fragmentary and in a way so anguished. I mean, they expressed, the anguish, which was the content of what survivors spoke about. And, often, they were expressed in tears and in sighs and in nightmares. Really the language of the body. These experiences were very deeply lodged and affected, the whole person, and often did very concretely affect, people's physical states and their health after. So yes, so initially it was, very difficult to put together a coherent narrative from these, fragmentary utterances. I mean, my mother kept returning to the fact of her sister's death again, in a sort of anguish. I understood later that I didn't know the chronology of the events, which, their personal events, as well as I should. In other words, I had to study it to some extent. So yes, so there was a kind of haunting by this past.
The idea of haunting is also present in your imaginative writing, and reminds me of your play, The Ceremony, which I must say I've had the privilege of reading and have seen a video of the reading performance in London. For those who haven't had the pleasure, let me just offer a very brief summary. The play is set during the 2001 ceremony in Poland, memorializing those who were murdered in Yevadne. The play is remarkable in so many ways, one of which is that it's filled with Jewish ghosts of the murdered who confront the second generation of Poles and Jews, and not just metaphorically, but as voices and as a presence on the stage. There have also been 3 recent Polish films that feature Jewish ghosts or spectral objects that haunt the second generation. So I'd like to ask you, what is your sense of what these ghosts or hauntings convey to us about Poland and the Holocaust, or the Holocaust more generally? And as your play indicates very pointedly, as you said earlier, to ongoing mass atrocities and genocides.
Well, I mean, in the play, I was trying to dramatize precisely the experience of the second generation and haunting by people we didn't know. As you know, I was haunted by the memory or the shadowy presence of my mother's sister. And I also wanted to dramatize different attitudes to those shades and what they demand of their descendants. So I call them shades rather than ghosts, but they do appear in 3 dimensions on the stage. So there is a shade who demands vengeance from his son, vengeance on those who betrayed him. And his son is, vows that he will exact vengeance. There is the shade of a mother who keeps saying to her son, please go and live your own life, get away, even as he wants to perform the impossible task of saving her from her mourning. There is a shade of a mother who is a kind of moral guide throughout the play and to her daughter, and who tries to explain how this terrible conflict started and erupted, and how it sort of erupted from what were rather peaceable relationships before the war. She tries to explain how it happened and the attitudes of various people. So there is also, the shade of the perpetrator, who I think is a figure rarely seen on stage or rarely thought about, but, who tries to explain what happened. And it's a very troubling shade. And, his speeches, I think, are probably very troubling, but he tries to explain how it was possible that, that he participated in these terrible deeds and this terrible massacre which took place in that town. And he also tries to explain his terrible guilt afterwards. There is also a Polish person, who wants to who wants to have the others to understand that there was a tragic Polish history as well, and that his father died in the Warsaw Uprising and the rubble of Warsaw, which was destroyed by the Germans, actually, in really terrible historical circumstances, as the Soviet army waited on the other side of the river after they had promised to come to the Poles' aid, and they waited for the Nazis to destroy the city. So he wants, this part of the history also to be understood. So yes, so this is what, I was trying to dramatize there, and very often we, the descendants of survivors, needed to mourn for people whom we didn't know. So this is, the very definition of the uncanny, or, people about whom we knew a lot, about whom we didn't know. So it was the, the unknown known. It is Freud's definition of the uncanny, and we were pursued by, these uncanny transferred experiences.
So family who could not have been known by the second generation, nonetheless have a very powerful presence as part of what is lost, but which the second generation wants so much to get to know as part of themselves and their own identity. And this reminds me that although you left Poland so many years ago, it remains such a dramatic presence in your writing. Would you like to tell us about its continuing importance to you, Poland's history, its presence in your life and in your writing today?
Yes, I will, but I wanted to say something about, the more general kind of haunting in Poland by that, tragic history, and, which is sometimes accompanied by a great deal of guilt, and sometimes by sort of, rejection of this part of Polish history. But sometimes it can have, in a sense, better consequences. And I'm thinking in particular about an encounter I had, and this is one way in which, Poland has remained very, very important in my life and a very vivid presence in my life. I think in 1990, I went to Poland and I met with this young man, a Polish man, a young man who had grown up after the war and who had never met any Jewish people, and who didn't know there had been Jews in his town, or in fact in Poland. And when he found out about this aspect of the Polish past, he started studying it, and he started being very engaged with it. And he said to me that he was going to start a festival of Jewish culture in Krakow. And he did. And it has been an absolutely wonderful, very big event for all these years. I don't know what has happened in the last 2 or 3 years, attended by thousands of people, very few of them Jewish, although some Jewish people come from abroad. And so, he has created this, festival of Jewish culture, which has been, very informative and very important. And I realized to what extent he became sort of Judaized himself when we met in the United States with other friends, and we're trying to figure out the date of our next meeting, and somebody suggested the date, and he said, no, I can't do it, then it's Pesach. It's Passover. So in other words, he became very identified with this history. So, this is one path which, people have taken. The other path is a kind of, rejection of that aspect of history. But yes, for me, Poland has remained important in many ways. I mean, first of all, there were 2 large immigrations from Poland, from which I have, derived many wonderful friendships, and also a kind of insight into Polish history. Many of them were Jewish. I mean, for example, the 1967 immigration was a Jewish immigration after the Communist Party sort of turned against its Jewish, members, and altogether, anti-Semitic disruptions in Poland. So there was that immigration, then there was the martial law immigration in 1981. And again, I met many people, and actually at that point I was editor and writer at the New York Times, and many of them were artists and musicians and filmmakers. And first of all, I learned about that aspect of Polish life. Secondly, I wrote about it quite a bit. So it has been a very important continuing presence in my life, and I have followed the various swings of the pendulum since 1989, and since those velvet revolutions. And if I have a moment more, I'll just say, that the swings of the pendulum were, first of all, an enormous eruption of interest in Jewish history and an examination of Jewish history and the Polish-Jewish relationship.
Mm-hmm.
This was, really an examination from which that ceremony, the real ceremony on which my play is based, emerged. I mean, it really followed on from a book written by Jan Gross called Neighbors. I think that was very reparative. And this Museum of Polish Jewish History, which really is a fabulous museum of the whole history, was erected. It was the first of the new historical museums which have, emerged in Poland in the last decades, but this was the first one, and it really is a wonderful museum which gives you the narrative of the very long Polish Jewish history, which began in the 11th century and had many very interesting stages, and very interesting, really institutional forms. I have a sense that I probably should not go on, that we perhaps are running out of time.
Yes, I'm wondering if we have time even for one more question.
Why don't we take a couple of questions from the audience and then come back to you? Is that all right, Phyllis? Okay.
Great.
Let's start with Atina Grossman, who asks, first, 2 questions. One, you speak about the turn from memory to history. How do you understand Marianne Hirsch's notion of post-memory? And the second question, more painful and immediate, you spoke eloquently about the transcultural confrontation, memory, and history of other genocides and crimes, and mentioned Cambodia, Rwanda, South Africa, among others. How do we cope with family histories of how family histories of the Holocaust respond to the Nakba, so the displacement of Palestinians in 1948. And she adds, "We are so good at avoiding this question at most of our events."
Yes. I'm afraid I'm very tempted to take the Fifth Amendment on that one. It is such a, tormenting question, and what is happening now is so tormenting that I think, this is where, I have to stop. And the notion of post-memory, I am not completely sure about the notion of post-memory, and I've talked to Marianne about that quite a bit. I think, the post-memory really needs to be converted into a more historical understanding of history, as I said. So briefly.
We have the questioners are lining up to ask questions. Let me just move quickly on. Anthony Polanski, how are we to respond to the rise of populism, which stresses subjectively created memory rather than history, and has made much more difficult the creation of a neutral space in which difficult problems of the dark history of the Second World War can be dispassionately discussed?
Sorry, can you repeat the beginning of that question? Sorry.
It's essentially asking, how are we to respond to the rise of populism?
Yes.
With its notions of subjectively created memory?
Yes. Well, I think, it is a very worrying phenomenon. And, it weakens, democracies. Certainly, we live in a post-truth era. I mean, altogether, and populism adds to that. And again, I think it's particularly a task of a second generation or altogether, of people to whom this history is important, to preserve historical truth in all of its complexity. I mean, I really think this is one of the great tasks. And also, I think, the strengthening of democracy. I mean, how we go about it, I do not know, but I think, this is something that we need to think about very strenuously. I mean, I often think about something said by Sebastian Haffner, who was a German journalist writing about the rise of Hitler in the late 1920s and the 1930s. And he said, the rise of Hitler was enabled not by strength of fascism, but by the weakness of democracy. And I think, this is quite a sobering and a frightening thought for us, because I think we have seen the weakening of democracy in so many countries and parts of the world. And I think actually that one of our important tasks for everybody, but perhaps for everybody who is aware of the dangers of weak democracy, is to create a strong culture of democracy, and a culture which can incorporate our differences in a framework of shared meanings and shared values.
We have a relevant question, actually, I think in a way a follow-up to what you've just said, from Susan Solomon, who asks if you might talk a little bit more about the subject of the latest developments in Poland so far as Jewish memory and history are concerned, referencing your New York Review of Books essay a few years back, and asking if how you think about that issue right now.
Yes. Well, I mean, just to say again briefly that there have been various phases of post-89 response to, the Jewish issue. And, the first phase of response was a very, it was a return of a repressed memory, first of all. I mean, and there was various memories which were repressed under the Soviet dispensation, which were censored. And, the Jewish memory was censored, as was the memory of the non-communist resistance. So it was a re-emergence from repression, and it led to a lot of re-examination. Now, I think, very simply, a very conservative government has been in charge since 2015. And, this government has engaged in some very troubling transactions with history and with historical memory. So that, for example, it has instituted a law which makes it a crime to accuse Poland of the Holocaust. Now, I do think that, for a while, there has been too much of a conflation between Poland and the Holocaust. I mean, Poland was sort of, the heart of darkness. And that, so that, the phrase Polish concentration camps was used very routinely. And this was, in fact, quite painful. However, after, the re-examination of all of this, there has now been this turn to making laws about interpretations of history. And this is, a very dangerous step. So this is, really what I feel. It's a very dangerous step. And in a sense, the EU, I think, should be, speaking of, stronger democracies, the EU, I think, should be much more energetic contesting this, or in contesting, Orban's Hungarian illiberal democracy.
Thank you so much, Eva. We have a set of questions that are about memory, the relationship between memory and history. And just to make sure that we've got time for answering everyone's question, and then getting back to Phyllis's question, I'm going to lump them together a little bit, which is to say that we have a question about, from Linda Dunleavy, to ask, in moving from memory to history, are you moving from personal experience to collective experience, or more to some notion of objective truth and reality in the history part, rather than to a subjective truth? And similarly, from Henry Greenspan, he's asking, do you think we're going backwards? Are we failing to understand the complexity of being a descendant of survivors or memory? And then again, on the subject of memory and history, from Anna Parkinson, I was wondering what the relationship between history and trauma is once memory is no longer the focus, but instead history is. Somatic symptoms could be read as one way that history manifests as memory expressed through the body, for instance.
I think that what I would want to do would be to incorporate memory into the understanding of history. But, that I think, the understanding, the historical understanding is very important. I mean, on a very concrete level, the generation of survivors is not going to be with us for much longer. And this, transmission of memory through testimonies of survivors is no longer going to be possible. So I think, that, for example, when the Holocaust is taught in schools, we will not have survivors who can recount their stories, which have often been a very powerful instrument, of teaching of this history. But that, as I say, I think, that what the second generation can do is incorporate this human experience and the sort of the consequences of the Holocaust, the personal consequences of the Holocaust, into the understanding of the broader history. I mean, for example, it is, a very unfair and terrible aspect of this history that the notion of shame and, humiliation and guilt is often transferred to the survivors, rather than, being acknowledged by perpetrators. Perpetrators very often, do not feel guilt. Some do, but very often they do not. So this, the sort of the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim is one of the things, and also what makes for a perpetrator. How are perpetrators, recruited? How are they initiated into what they do? In other words, these very particular human meanings can be incorporated, I think needs to be incorporated into our larger understanding of history. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Stefan Ionescu, who asks if you'll talk about your parents' relationship with their non-Jewish countrymen and the Polish imagined national community after their emigration to Canada, more generally after 1945, but also after their emigration to Canada.
Sorry, have I talked to?
No, if you would talk a little bit about your parents' relationships with non-Jewish fellow Poles after 45 and then after their emigration to Canada.
Well, perhaps my parents were influenced by their history, in which they were in fact saved by Poles and Ukrainians. So I don't think that they, saw anti-Semitism, within every Polish person. So there were some, perfectly good relationships, they had with non-Jewish neighbors and with non-Jewish friends. And I had, non-Jewish friends when I was growing up. I think immigration complicated all of this terribly. And in a sense, immigration for them was an exile from the past, as well as from Poland. It was altogether a very difficult immigration for them, but it was an exile from the past because, in Poland, however terrible their history was, it was a history which was understood. And even if it wasn't shared with, non-Jewish Poles, it was understood. And also they had, Jewish friends who went through similar experiences. In Canada, and then later for me in the United States for quite a long time, the past simply didn't count. That past didn't count, and people didn't particularly want to hear about it. And I think this was, very painful. And in a sense, the sort of the foregrounding of the memory of the Holocaust, which happened at some point, did have its reparative aspect in that, they felt that it was an experience which counted and which was perhaps being examined or understood.
Thank you. We have a question from Tamara Eisenberg, who asks whether you think that the term third generation has meaning. And I suppose I can imagine that your answer to that is partly it has no more meaning than the meaning of the second generation, or perhaps even less. But anyway, I'm curious to know as well.
Sorry, what did you just at the end?
Just whether you think that the term third generation is useful. And we have as well a question from Anna Karolina Viana to ask how sort of beyond the third generation, do you see the continuation of the Holocaust sort of knowledge being perpetuated?
I think the third generation does seem to have a meaning, and, you know, quite a strong meaning. I mean, I think, you know, unto the third generation, you know, has a certain truth about it. I am often surprised by how profoundly, you know, people who belong to the third generation have been affected by this, you know, transferred history. And often, you know, they have been affected by not knowing about it, by the silences in their families. You know, there have been families which have been silent. And so they know that something, you know, there is something which happened, something shadowy which has happened, but they don't know what. And it seems that, you know, this is often very anguishing for people. And you know, quite a bit of writing has, you know, emerged from this. At the same time, it seems that, you know, survivors themselves have often found it easier to talk to their grandchildren than to their children. Because I suppose because there isn't this kind of, you know, fear of passing on the sort of the guilt, the humiliation, the, you know, other terrible sort of emotional sequelae of their experiences, which were often, in fact, passed into, you know, into the psyches of the second generation.
We have, thank you, Eva. We have a couple of short questions, and then I want to give Phyllis the last question, since I know she had a number of questions that she wanted to ask. Just the short questions from Stanislas Kolar, writing in from the Czech Republic to ask, have you got one book from a second or third generation writer that you would especially recommend? And we've got some suggestions on that point in the chat, but asking you whether there's a particular book. I know you go into a number of these books in After Such Knowledge, but is there something you would want to particularly put forth?
Well, for a Czech interlocutor, let me recommend Helen Epstein's books, since, you know, she comes from a Czech background. And New Lives was a very important book. And now there is a new book called Francie's War, which was, you know, about her parental experiences. So, you know, I mean, just, you know, if that has a particular meaning within Czech history, then that might be interesting. There are so many books and so many interesting books. I am very interested, very much like a book by Philippe Sands, called East-West Street, a book which has, you know, been a very great international hit. But I like it partly because of this combination of, you know, memory and historical knowledge. I mean, he discovers by accident, I mean, first of all, you know, the excavation of his history takes place in Lviv, as I will always call it, or Lviv, as it is called now. And the tiny shtetl from which my parents came was near Lviv. This was, you know, the most dangerous vicinity to be in. But he discovers, you know, really by accident, that the city from which his grandfather and his extended family come from was also the city from which Lauterpacht and Lemkin came from, the two people who were responsible for notions of genocide and human rights. And so, you know, this really is a very a very meaningful discovery, and you know, and a discovery which absolutely conjoins, you know, his personal history with the larger history and, the origin of these concepts, which have been so crucial for us, so crucial in addressing, the crimes of genocide. So I would recommend that actually quite highly.
We have, there's been quite a lively discussion as well of what the name of the play is and how to get a copy of the ceremony.
Yes, yes, the discussion, you mean why I named it the ceremony?
No. Just people writing into the chat wanting to know what the name of the play was. They just didn't catch the name, but also wanting to know how they could get a copy of it. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Phyllis for the last question, although I'm going to reserve actually a last question from the chat, which I think is very symbolic of Eva's position in general. But anyway, can people get a copy of it? And back to Phyllis after that.
I'm afraid the copies are only available personally right now. Right, to Phyllis or to me.
No, I would only pass them along with Eva's permission, of course.
Yeah. I mean,
the fact that Eva mentioned Philippe Sand's book, East West Street, as one of her highly recommended texts, I think that your recommendation dovetails with something we've been talking about. And because Sand's book is a hybrid genre, it's personal exploration, it's legal investigation, the historical detective work, and delving into how the two terms, Lauterbach and Lemkin's genocide and crimes against humanity, figured in and out of the Nuremberg trials. But this idea of a hybrid exploration of the Holocaust and its aftermath strikes me that it goes so close to what you were saying, Eva, about how to combine memory, testimony, representation, and so forth, and reminds me that scholars have worried about the ethics of Holocaust representation for so long, but it's an issue that doesn't end. And you yourself have represented the Holocaust in different genres. Reflective history, fiction, radio, plays, and so forth. And today, of course, we have a proliferation continuing of Holocaust fiction. And of course, it turns up in social media, something I don't indulge in, but I know from lots of younger people that it's out there in every imaginable and unimaginable manifestation. And so it doesn't seem as though there are any limits to how the Holocaust can be represented. And so I wanted to ask you, does this concern you? And if so, how and to what consequence?
Well, it concerns me a great deal, I mean, there are no limits to Holocaust representation or, to Holocaust denial, in fact. I mean, David Irving, the soi-disant Holocaust historian who is a Holocaust denier, has a very large following. So, of course, it is very concerning. And, it has to do with, our digital age. And it is, very hard to know how to think about it, except we need to inculcate people into being able to think for themselves, into being able to distinguish, truth from falsehood. And I think, this is a part of the building of strong democracies. That strong democracies, need citizens who understand, the distinction between, truth and falsehood, and who can understand, complexities of some situations and histories. I don't know, yes, if this is a satisfactory answer, but yeah.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and I think it's a reflection of Eva's oracular status. This question, I'm going to ask it from Mary Lee Webeck. What is the hardest question that you have yet to find an answer to? I want to know the answer to that too. So Eva Hoffman could have been asked to talk to us about any number of subjects, and now this one sort of opens up the field. The hardest question to which you've yet to find an answer.
What is to be done? To quote, the title of a Russian book. What is to be done? And it actually has to do with, there are many questions which are very difficult to answer. But I have thought about this quite a bit, and it's that, that in a sense, we have gotten better. We've become better we've improved in dealing with the aftermath of genocides or of terrible events, terrible interethnic events. So that, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after the South African, after the end of apartheid, was very reparative. It was very reparative. If I have a moment to just tell you about one bit of testimony which I heard from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was from a man who was really blinded in some atrocity, during the apartheid era. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not try to achieve legal justice, but it enabled people, it enabled victims to confront the perpetrators and to talk about what happened. And he kept confronting his perpetrator. And, he kept asking him, did you say this terrible thing to me? Did you say this horrible thing to me when you were torturing me? And the perpetrator finally said, yes, I did. And the man, who really was literally blind, said, I want to thank the commission because I was blind and now I can see. Mm-hmm. I think what he meant was that, his moral world, the moral order of the world was restored to some extent, was restored. And, recognition is really what we owe to, survivors of terrible events, and really, perhaps the only reparations, that we can offer. So we have become better, and with that, but we have not learned how to prevent these terrible things from happening. I mean, we have the events in Myanmar. We have, the Uyghurs in China. We have had the war in Syria, the endless war in Syria, in which the responsibility to protect was not exercised, in which the democracies were, in a sense, helpless or unwilling to take action. So I suppose if there is a very hard problem, this is one of them.
I'm going to turn back over to Sarah Cushman, who has appeared on the screen, just to say thank you for spending your evening, London evening, our afternoon with us. It's been terrific to have you.
Thank you, and thank you for these, very thought-provoking and wonderful questions.
Well, thank you, Eva. This has been a really wonderful occasion and opportunity for all of us.
And I just wanted.
And by the way, like Deborah, I very much look forward to seeing you in London.
Well, I look forward to seeing you in, quite a few
wherever.
Questions. So yes, I think of London as my midway point between Manhattan and Krakow. So I hope to see many of you here.
And I just jump in here again to say thank you, Eva, for joining us this afternoon, this evening. And thank you also to Phyllis and Deborah for your really interesting conversation. Thank you all, and thank you to the participants as well. And this event has been recorded, and we'll make it available on our website soon. Again, thank you so much, and wish a lovely evening to everyone.